Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirstin Evenden. Thank you so much for joining us to our first online event at Lougheed House. We're thrilled to have you all with us. I'm the executive director here at the house, and before we get started, I do want to acknowledge the oral practices and the traditional territories of the Blackfoot, the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani, also the Tsuut'ina, the Sarsi, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations and the Métis homeland. We are on Métis Nation of Alberta's Region 3 here today. So thank you so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to having this online conversation with you all about a pandemic that until recently was called a forgotten pandemic. But given the interesting and strange circumstances we find ourselves in, this seems an opportune moment to gather, and we have two great panelists with us today to speak to the Spanish flu and maybe some of the differences and interesting similarities from 1918 to where we find ourselves in 2020. First of all, welcome Harry Saunders. He is a local historian. For those who may not have met Harry before, he's written about the Spanish flu, and we look forward to his wonderful stories. Caroline Loewen is also with us. She is the curator at Lougheed House, and will be speaking to how Lougheed House and Senator and Lady Lougheed were connected to the war and the Spanish flu right after that. What was going on in Calgary at the time? The house has always been a witness to that history. So we'll jump right in. If you have questions towards the end, we're going to entertain questions as time allows, and by all means, love to hear from you. As we get started, I was wondering, Caroline, if you could speak to what was happening in Calgary at that moment in time. The war's ending, so much has happened with the horror of this war and the kind of introduction of Canada as kind of a nation on the world stage. What was happening in Calgary at this point?
Sure, yeah. You're right. There was a lot going on in Calgary at the end of 1918. So the flu came to Calgary in October of 1918. So as we know, of course, the war was coming to an end at that time. It hadn't quite ended. It was still wrapping up, but there was still fighting happening and there were still soldiers being deployed, but a lot of soldiers were also coming home. So a lot of reunited families. But a lot of the issues that stemmed from the war, actually, with all of the soldiers returning, was there was mass unemployment and there was a lot of labor unrest. So a lot of people actually pinpoint 1919 as a year where there was a lot of labor unrest, there were strikes, there was a lot happening. But of course, things don't just come out of a vacuum. A lot of that labor unrest had actually started in 1918. Earlier in the year, there had been several local strikes in Calgary. Hotel employees had gone on strike. Waitresses had gone on strike. The Postal Service had gone on strike. A lot of little smaller strikes. And actually in October of 1918, there was an active strike, the largest of the year actually. And that was the CPR workers, the railway freight handlers. And actually a lot of other industries had gone on strike in solidarity with the CPR workers. So a lot of other industries were also on strike. So there was a lot of unrest, a lot of uncertainty with where people's futures were going, with what was going to happen with labor, with people wanting to get, fair wages and good working conditions for people returning from the war. Of course, also, we were in a time of prohibition. We were in a time of women's rights really changing. 2 years ago, women had got the right to vote in Alberta in 1916, and women were really advocating for their rights as they had seen their role in society really change throughout the war. So those were some of the little backdrop to what was happening when the flu came to Calgary. A lot of unrest, a lot of changes, a lot of social changes, and people kind of willing to stand up for their rights, a lot of social activism happening.
And so this social activism was in part because of what had been happening during the war, correct? And then you've also got a growing population in Calgary, population numbering in the 4,000-ish range, correct, when the war is ending? Is that right, or?
The population in Calgary at the time was about 60,000.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the population had grown. We had quite a population boom just leading up to the war. And around 1918, the population was about 60,000.
Okay, and so we've got these large numbers of soldiers who are wounded coming back, and then all of a sudden, the actual flu itself begins to appear in Europe, and we're looking at right now about the spring of 1918, and it's starting to make an appearance in Europe and begin to make its way westward in North America. So can you speak to a bit of the origin of the name of the Spanish flu?
Sure. Yeah, so when we talk about the Spanish flu in Calgary, we're actually talking about the second wave of the flu. The first wave of the flu, like you said, was actually in the spring, and it hit kind of in different areas of the world, but you're right, it kind of started east of us. A lot of cases were popping up in Europe, and a lot of cases were popping up in Spain, but not just Spain, all throughout kind of Western Europe. But what was really interesting about the flu there was that the Spanish king actually contracted the flu. He didn't die of it, but he contracted it. And so it was obviously publicized in Spain that this flu was going through because their king had contracted it. And Spain had been neutral during World War I. And so they actually had a lot more media freedom. During World War I, countries that were active in the war had put constraints on their media and were controlling what they could actually report on because they wanted to keep morale high. They wanted to kind of control the messaging that was going out. But because Spain hadn't participated in World War I, they were neutral, their media was actually free to report on the Spanish flu, on what was happening. And so, of course, the Spanish flu is a misnomer. So it was named the Spanish flu because of those two factors, the fact that the Spanish king contracted it early on, and the fact that the Spanish media was actually free to report on it. Because we don't actually know where the flu originated. I think one of the things scientists think they know for sure is that it probably didn't actually start in Spain. There's a few different theories about where it started. Some people think Kansas, some people think England, but it almost certainly did not start in Spain.
Right, okay. So there's some knowledge that it's coming our way, so to speak, in Calgary towards the end of the year, so in the fall. I'm going to turn over to Harry now a bit. Thanks for that, Caroline, for that context. Harry, maybe you could speak a bit to the Spanish flu, its arrival in the city itself, and what was happening? How did the city respond? What were the clues that it actually was arriving? How did the city speak to it as well?
Well, it's nicely documented. Here's a case where we know the moment that it arrived in Calgary, and I have to acknowledge a debt of gratitude to Janice Dickin, who researched and wrote about this in the 70s, and her paper published in Alberta History at that time is a good source, for what we know about the experience of the flu pandemic in Calgary. It started to make news seriously in Calgary in September. Of course, we don't have radio yet, so it's newspapers, and I suppose also bulletins being posted outside of the newspaper offices. We had 3 dailies at the time, but it's
3 dailies.
3 dailies, yes. The Calgary Canadian was the 3rd daily. A lot of historians know it as the Calgary News Telegram. It was over a decade old, so Dr. Cecil Stanley Mahood. We all look to Dr. Tam and Dr. Hinshaw these days. And in Calgary at that time, the medical officer of health was Cecil Stanley Mahood. He'd moved here several years earlier from Ontario, and he was the point man, really, and the one who would issue the medical bulletins and really be the trusted authority. He received notice. He got a telegram on October 1st or 2nd, 1918, that one of those troop trains, and there were many, you and Caroline mentioned that the soldiers were returning, and of course their prime mechanism for the movement of this virus. Dr. Mahood got advance notice from authorities in Regina that this train was going to come in at 3 a.m. October 2nd, 1918, into the CPR station in Calgary, right where the Calgary Tower is now. And that there were sick men aboard, a dozen or so. So Dr. Mahood, and I've got a picture of Dr. Mahood I'd like to show you guys. This is taken decades later, mind you. He's, hold on a moment. Let's see. I can't see the screen, no. Can you guys see the photo of Dr. Mahood?
It's a gentleman between two nurses, and
That's
he's
right,
in a
yes.
suit.
Yeah,
Okay.
with a nice big smile. And the nurses are identified as well, although this photograph is taken in 1936. But it just gives you a visual impression of the guy who was in charge at the moment. So he and another physician arrived at the station with a military detail. So the train was sealed. Nobody was allowed on or off. They escorted these men off. And only Dr. Mahood came into direct contact with them. One of them had to be carried off in a stretcher, and they were taken to the isolation hospital. See, there were already an isolation hospital established in any city to keep these kind of communicable diseases away from the general hospital population. So the Calgary General Hospital and the Holy Cross Hospital, oh, thank you very much, we're already in operation. Here we're seeing the old Calgary General Hospital, built in the 1890s. Incidentally, Kirstin, you could tell us the Lougheed connection to this building as well.
Yeah, Caroline, you were going to mention that.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want to speak to that? This is where the ruins are today down at Stampede. That's what this is building now, all that remains of it. But Caroline, I'll let you go into detail on that.
Yeah, so this building obviously is ruined, and it's now known as Rundle Ruins. And when this photograph was taken, it was actually already converted, I think, into Rundle Lodge. So this photograph is from the 1940s, but the building was the General Hospital originally. And I believe the connection is that James Lougheed actually was sort of opened the hospital ceremonially. And so his name, among other prominent Calgarians, is inscribed into the cornerstone, which actually still exists as part of Rundle Ruins.
Very true. And so that's the cornerstone that these Spanish influenza patients would have gone past as they were taken into this emergency hospital. It took only till the 7th of October for the first death. It was a man named Hazen Spearin. And within days after that, Dr. Mahood realized that there was what was considered an epidemic. The term epidemic, I think, is more local than a pandemic, which is universal. So he immediately knew that they must launch into avoidance of crowds and quarantining and placarding of affected homes. And he got ahead of the legislation in this case. It was the provincial authority that allowed for the kind of measures that could be taken, such as quarantining. And to this point, influenza was not as considered to be such a serious condition that it required quarantining. So when Dr. Mahood issued this order, when they started to quarantine affected homes and preventing the breadwinner from going to work, it was a week before the legislature got it together and amended the Health Act to allow for local authorities to do this kind of quarantining. And also within days, by about mid-October, Dr. Mahood had identified the condition as what was called an epidemic. And by the end of that week, so this is around mid-October, schools were closed. And so were pool rooms, dance halls, places of entertainment, theaters, and there were restricted hours on stores. And some of the things that occurred then as now were things like getting customers in stores to hurry along, not linger, and make their purchases quickly. Anyway, this carried on, and also they issued orders for mask wearing. First, it was people who were dealing directly with the sick. Then it was public officials, such as streetcar motor conductors, who were dealing with the public on a regular basis. And then it was pretty much everybody. And nurses gathered in the Memorial Park Library, which of course is within blocks of the Lougheed House, to have mask-making bees for masks that could be sold to the public for 10 cents a piece. And I don't know if we'll get into the resistance to mask wearing, but I'll just say quickly, by mid-November, occurrences were starting to decline, and that's right about the time that the war was coming to an end, which is the other thing that is on everybody's minds at the time. So Caroline, if you've got that photograph showing November 11th, 1918 in Calgary, Remembrance Day is a solemn occasion for us, but the first one, the armistice, as it occurred, as it was celebrated and recognized on November 11th, 1918, was a celebration. So in a lot of these photographs, you see people with their masks pulled down around their necks. They're throwing caution to the wind. Everyone's out congregating and celebrating, as they shouldn't, because it's still communicable, even though the occurrences and the fatalities are declining every day by mid-November. Dr. Mahood himself knew there would be what would be in Calgary a second wave. This is the, Caroline has mentioned that this is the second wave globally that hits Calgary, but we're going to have our own second wave come December. But people felt, with the war coming to an end, we've defeated the foreign enemy, the war was over. There was just this kind of sensation across Canada and probably across the Allied nations that we beat it. It was back to normal times. We'd beaten the pandemic as well. And even though Dr. Mahood knew better, provincial authorities issued lightening of restrictions. So cinemas reopened, schools reopened, and we know the result. By early December, a second deadlier wave hit. That was finally resolved in January with a cost of lives in Calgary of something like 384 officially, and probably many more. So that's the outline of the experience of the pandemic in Calgary.
And there's a particular individual, you have an image of a woman by the name of Effie Bagnall, who was a nurse at the time, who unfortunately succumbed to the virus. Could you show a picture of her, and then we'll move on to another picture of some other nurses who were working hard to support the efforts locally.
Yes, and this photograph, I have to acknowledge, sorry, I'm just figuring, there, share screen, sorry about this. Can you guys see Effie Bagnall?
I see the image. There you go. Yep.
Yep. And I have to acknowledge this was gathered from Ancestry, where Barbara Crystal, who's married into the Bagnall family, had posted it. Effie Bagnall was a nurse. By this time, she was active with the Children's Aid Society and other charitable organizations. The Calgary Herald characterized her as one of the best known women in Southern Alberta at the time. And she is one of so many people, particularly women, who volunteered for service as nurses or as nurses' aides, anything, delivering cooking and delivering food. And one thing, Caroline, you were probably going to get into, but I'll just lay it out here right now briefly, is that since men had been volunteering for military service for the past 5 years in the war, there was sort of this zeitgeist that now's the time for women to step up and be volunteers to fight the Spanish influenza, which resulted in so many women in the line of fire of this new battle, and with great loss of life, including Effie's.
Caroline's going to go over to another picture now.
Sure,
but my understanding too, while she's getting that up, is that women, of course, were teachers back in the day, and when schools shut, the assumption was that these women were then directed to support the effort, either in supporting soup kitchens or becoming nurses, that kind of thing. Over to you, Caroline.
Yeah, I mean, it really was a community effort, and a lot of the people that volunteered were women. One of the things I found interesting researching this was that originally, doctors didn't know what caused the influenza. They actually thought it was a bacterial infection. And so there were no real known treatments or no real known effective treatments medically. There were all sorts of quack treatments. Like, I was reading the newspaper and someone was saying, rub chili paste on your chest and that will get rid of the flu, or take gin pills for your kidneys, which was apparently gin in a pill format that you take, and it was supposed to help with kidneys. So there were all these sorts of treatments that were ineffective. The only real effective treatment or care was nursing care, so to have nurses come into the home and just care for people's basic needs, and to sort of, that's how people would get better, being sort of given their immune system time to kill the virus itself and to defeat the virus. So the burden of care actually fell on these nurses. And you're right, Kirstin, teachers and other women that were out of work volunteered, and they sort of saw it as their sort of opportunity to participate in sort of a communal effort. So this photograph here is a photograph of women that were part of the Victorian Order of Nurses. And that was a group of women that were nurses that really focused on rural nursing. So the Spanish flu hit the cities, but it also hit rural areas quite hard, and it hit a lot of smaller towns quite hard. And so nurses from Calgary and Edmonton would go out to some of these smaller centers. And just to speak a bit more about the Lougheed connection as well, Isabella Lougheed was the first president of the Victorian Order of Nurses. So she wasn't trained as a nurse, but she was really active in the community and was involved with a lot of these what we would call now nonprofit organizations that were really interested in community care. She was also a founding member of the Women's Hospital Aid Society, which was essentially like an auxiliary to the general hospital. So one that did fundraising and would have done other volunteer efforts to support the fight against the Spanish flu.
One thing, if I may add, just a detail about teachers and the fight against the Spanish flu. One of the purposes for closing the schools, I mean, it was, you know, to protect the children from congregating and being vulnerable. But the other, and I think particularly in the second wave, was just to free the teachers for service as volunteer nurses. And that was both school boards, public and Catholic. And one of the Roman Catholic teachers died while serving. She contracted the flu. She had died either of the flu or of pneumonia, which was another big killer following as a result of the flu. Yeah, that's and another just quickly, one of the services that Dr. Mahood rendered to the teachers was to delay the reopening of the schools, not because it was necessary for the efficacy of the students or the faculty at the schools or staff, but to give the teachers a rest because they just come off of intensive nursing during a pandemic, and he wanted them to have a chance to have a rest before they returned to the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of schools also were used as isolation hospitals. So they actually repurposed all of the schools while they were empty of children to care for people. So I know Colonel Walker School was used. A couple of other schools of those original Sanso schools were used as hospitals.
That's right. Colonel Walker and Victoria was a convalescent ward. And then a lot of the other sandstone schools were used as soup kitchens and distribution centers for the distribution of soup and junket, which I've never had junket in my life, but it's some sort of sweet dessert that they made, and custard. And then in the second wave, Stanley Jones School became the second emergency hospital.
Caroline, did you want to speak to James Lougheed's role as things were winding up with the war, and a bit about his role coming into the flu pandemic?
Yeah, sure, for sure. So the photograph I've just shared is the Senate. So James Lougheed was a senator. He was the leader of the House actually during the Spanish flu. And he was also the Minister of Soldiers' Civil Reestablishment, which was essentially a precursor to Veterans Affairs. So very connected to public health. And one of the things that people have maybe heard about the Department of Health was that federally, Canada actually didn't have a Department of Health until the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was the impetus for the creation of the Department of Health. Alberta, fortunately, was a bit ahead of that, and we had actually created a Department of Health in 1907, just 2 years after becoming a province. And so we kind of had that established. We had local boards of health and we had the provincial board of health, but there was no federal board of health. It was actually health was actually under the Department of Agriculture, which I found kind of strange and interesting, maybe related to food production and safety of food. That was sort of my guess. I don't totally know. But in 1919, as a result of the Spanish flu, government officials, James Lougheed being one of them, advocated for the creation of a Department of Public Health. And I've actually dug through some of the Senate records and looked at a lot of the debates, and James Lougheed advocated for that federally we needed an organization to protect public health, and he argued for a centralized body to do that. And one of the main things that they were really worried about, and which is obviously still a thing that happens today, is they were worried that there was going to be conflict between the provinces and the feds when it came to health. And so one of the things they were really concerned about was how to ensure that the federal Department of Health would coordinate and cooperate with the provincial boards of health. And so this was a major concern of where that control should end up. And of course, healthcare is considered a provincial, under sort of the provincial government as opposed to the federal government. And that may also be why they were a bit slow to implement this. But essentially, the Spanish flu and World War I, with all of the returning soldiers, created a need for a public health body. And the government needed to start looking at health as a community concern as opposed to an individual concern. And so they needed to have a centralized body that could do that.
And so in terms of impact locally as well, you know, I'm kind of moving into this idea of comparing a bit what happened then to what happened today. Caroline, you dug up an interesting archival document related to the mines in southern Alberta and what was happening kind of at the grassroots or community level, you know, relating to things like labor strikes and that sort of thing. But did you want to show that and explain a bit about, we've seen where the policymakers were and how those connections were happening with responses to the First World War and what was happening when the soldiers came back. And here's something that was happening in southern Alberta.
Sure, here's a local story. So this is, these are the daily reports from the Rosedale Mine, and Rosedale is just outside of Drumheller. And Drumheller is one of the places in Alberta that was hardest hit by the Spanish flu. So these reports are really interesting to read because they're just reports of sort of the daily going-ons at the mine. And of course, they're impacted by the war, they're impacted by the strikes. You can actually find references to the CPR strikes in here, how that is impacting their ability to get coal transported on the railways. And they also reference the Spanish flu, and a lot of workers were trying to sort of navigate, as people are today, whether to continue working, whether to quit their jobs and stay at home. I mean, there weren't the same sort of job protections for people. So what we actually find as we read through these documents is a lot of people are refusing to go to work because they don't feel like their workplace is safe. I mean, if you look at the reference here, you can say, it says someone is driving today in the place of one of the drivers that quit, so just decided not to come to work because the risk was too high. And so again, a lot of the labor unrest is wanting these sorts of protections for workers, that they don't have to go to an unsafe workplace and that they have rights to protect themselves. I pulled this one up particularly because I thought it was quite, was very interesting because they're actually repurposing and taking some of the workers from the mine to dig graves. And they speak here about digging 25 graves in one day for the dead in Drumheller, which was one of the hardest hit places, like I said, in Alberta. And so these workers didn't really have much of a choice of whether they worked or not, and they were sort of brought into the effort to fight the flu.
These kinds of things really bring it home to me. And I'm wondering if both of you can maybe end up speaking just for a minute, each of you, on sort of some of the things you know of with regard to this historical moment in time and how things may or may not be different to what we're experiencing today in terms of your reference back to these really personal stories. Start with you, Harry.
Sure. One of the things Caroline was just talking about, the miners being repurposed as grave diggers, and this happened in Calgary as well. The only way that the city was able to not have a grave shortage for Spanish flu victims was to second waterworks employees from their job digging and maintaining underground subsurface waterworks, and instead dig graves. The other, so you know, I mean, that just no more needs to be said about that thought. It's very evocative. The things that occur to me is just some of the same narratives playing out. The resistance to mask wearing happened at that time. People would be fined. It was on the books that you could get a $50 fine, but most people just got a $1 fine. But day after day after day, you'd have people hauled into court to answer for not wearing masks in public. And it even got one of the two physicians were hauled in. One of them was on the Board of Health, and he was also the president of the Board of Trade, later became Lieutenant Governor of Alberta. The pressure from the business community and from City Council to end restrictions and resume business as normal. You know, we have that narrative again as well. And also back then, I mean, you can understand the hurt that people had of not being able to work or not being able to make money. There's an estimate, I think it was something like $500 million or $5 billion. I can't remember which or what it would be in modern dollar figures. But you know what I mean? You have the two narratives at that time, the same as today, about the matter of a quick reopening or being more cautious, and the resultant second wave in Calgary that occurred because it was too soon.
I think too, Dr. Mahood clearly was a compassionate person who really, for the moment, seemed to make some interesting, good decisions. I don't know anything about him personally. There might be more information on that, but the idea of connecting back with someone in Regina who's able to give them the heads up in Alberta in advance of this, despite somewhat limited communication. You know, the issue of communication in the moment, being transparent, of course, with people like Dr. Hinshaw, it seems very critical today. So thanks for the introduction to him and for all of your wonderful stories today, Harry. Caroline, did you want to wrap up with a kind of before, then and now, if you like?
Sure. I mean, I think the most striking thing, and I think you can probably, this happens in all sorts of emergencies and times when communities need to come together, is the reliance on the volunteer effort. And I think the government and the local government and the provincial government did a lot to control the Spanish flu. Some of the things they did were failures. For example, they tried to quarantine entire cities, and that just didn't work. And so they were sort of trying to find their feet and do a lot of figuring out as they went. And I think we're doing a little bit of that too. I mean, hopefully, well, definitely more based on science now because we have a better handle on what this is. But I think while governments and policies are still trying to kind of find their feet and figure out what works, in both cases, you see people stepping up, like individual people stepping up and doing what needs to be done. And I think looking at some of the Spanish flu stories and seeing, I mean, the way Calgary was in 1918 was a lot of people still needed to go outside to pump their water. And they needed to go out and collect firewood to keep their house warm. And they didn't have the same obvious modern conveniences that we had. And so it actually took labor to keep their house warm and safe and to keep people fed and watered. And a lot of volunteers were the ones that stepped up and did that. So it's the little things like going to the store and getting groceries for your neighbor. Back then, that looked like going out to the well and pumping water for them. Or it looked like, you know, chopping wood and bringing it to them. And I think there's parallels, not just in Calgary, but just, I mean, any time that neighborhoods and communities are in trouble, that's kind of what you see happening, is the individual effort.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note, just in some respects, there are a lot of people having a lot of challenges right now, but I think it's interesting to look back at what they had all just been through, which was the First World War. And what came rushing at them and really didn't die down until a couple of years after the flu pandemic was really over, even though it actually went on for some time, right to the mid-century. On that note, I do want to thank you all for joining us. This was kind of a good first kick at the can. If you're interested in joining us again for this kind of thing, we're hoping to broaden things out perhaps in the coming weeks. Ideas for topics or time of day, do let us know. Would love to hear from you all, and I want to thank again both Harry and Caroline, and thank you all for joining us. This was tea time. This is my little my teacup I brought with me. It's a family heirloom, and who knows? It was prohibition, so you know, if you need to kick off work early and have a drink with us, maybe we'll look at doing something like this again. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.